In the early autumn of 2018, park rangers patrolling the vast expanse of the Arrowhead National Forest made a routine but unsettling discovery. It was a campsite tucked away just off a designated trail that appeared to have been abruptly abandoned. A high-quality two-person tent stood zipped shut against the elements, but a palpable stillness hung in the air, a silence that felt deeper than the usual quiet of the woods. Inside the tent, investigators would later find a scene of near-perfect order that only amplified the mystery. A sleeping bag was unrolled, an inflatable pillow lay at its head, and a paperback novel rested face down on top, its pages marking a reader's last pause. A wallet containing cash, credit cards, and an identification card for a man named Ethan Hayes sat beside it, alongside a set of car keys. Everything a person needed to return to their life was present, except for the person himself. Outside, the remnants of a campfire formed a circle of cold, gray ash. A single camping chair was pointed towards the fire pit, as if waiting for its occupant to return and rekindle the flames against the evening chill. Ethan Hayes' car was located later that day, parked exactly where he had left it at the trailhead several miles away. But of Ethan, a responsible and experienced outdoorsman, there was no trace. The initial question on everyone's mind was simple, yet profoundly disturbing. Where had he gone? Ethan Hayes was, by all accounts, a man who lived his life with intention and care. At 28 years old, he had built a successful career as a software engineer in a bustling city. Yet he found his true solace in the quiet solitude of nature. He was not a reckless thrill seeker, but a meticulous planner, someone who respected the power of the wilderness and always prepared accordingly. His friends and family described him as the anchor of their lives. He was the one who remembered birthdays, who offered to help friends move without being asked, and who possessed a calm, reassuring presence that made others feel safe. He was close with his parents and his younger sister, Sarah, with whom he shared a particularly strong bond. They were more than siblings, they were confidants. The camping trip to Arrowhead National Forest was meant to be a weekend of quiet reflection for Ethan. He had recently completed a demanding project at work and told his family he needed to disconnect and recharge. He planned to hike, read, and simply exist without the constant buzz of notifications and deadlines. It was a solo trip, something he had done many times before without incident. Before leaving, Ethan followed his usual safety protocol. He shared a detailed itinerary with Sarah, including a map of the park with his intended campsite circled in red ink. He promised to check in via text message once he arrived at the trailhead and again upon his return on Sunday evening. This level of preparation was typical for Ethan. It was a reflection of his responsible nature and his consideration for his family's peace of mind. On Friday afternoon, just as planned, Sarah's phone chimed with a message from her brother. It read, "At the trailhead, weather is perfect, phone going off. See you Sunday night." It was the last communication anyone would ever receive from Ethan Hayes. Sarah replied with a simple, "Have fun, love you," feeling no sense of alarm, only a quiet happiness that her brother was getting his much-needed break. Sunday came and went. As evening deepened into night, a small seed of worry began to sprout in Sarah's mind. Ethan was punctual to a fault. If he said he would be back Sunday evening, he would be back Sunday evening, likely with a call to let them know he was on his way home from the park. But the call never came. By Monday morning, the family's quiet concern had blossomed into full-blown panic. Ethan had not shown up for work, an unprecedented occurrence. His boss called his parents, who in turn called Sarah, their voices tight with a shared, unspoken fear. They collectively decided they could wait no longer. Just before 9 a.m, Ethan's father contacted the county sheriff's department to formally report his son missing. The authorities initially treated it as a case of a lost or possibly injured hiker. The sheriff's department coordinated with the Park Service, and a ranger was dispatched to the trailhead Ethan had specified in his itinerary. The ranger quickly located Ethan's silver sedan, parked neatly in a designated spot. The vehicle was locked, and a glance through the window showed nothing amiss inside. The discovery of the car confirmed Ethan had made it to the park, and a search and rescue operation was immediately mobilized. Teams began combing the trail leading from the parking area toward the campsite he had marked on his map. The terrain was dense and rugged in places, a mixture of thick forest and rocky outcrops that could easily conceal a fallen hiker. It did not take long for searchers to find the campsite. It was located precisely where Ethan's map indicated it would be, a testament to his methodical nature. But the scene that greeted them was deeply perplexing. The undisturbed state of the tent, the presence of his wallet and keys, all suggested that Ethan had intended to return. It did not look like the camp of someone who had wandered off and become lost. It looked like the camp of someone who had been suddenly and inexplicably plucked from his surroundings. As the first day of the search drew to a close with no sign of Ethan, a more ominous feeling began to settle over the operation. The initial theory of a simple hiking accident seemed less and less likely. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, and no indication that any wild animals had disturbed the site. The woods remained stubbornly silent, holding their secrets close. The search expanded over the following days into one of the largest in the region's recent history. Dozens of trained volunteers joined professional search and rescue teams. K9 units were brought in, their handlers hoping the dogs could pick up Ethan's scent from an article of clothing retrieved from his car. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras crisscrossed the sky, their rotors beating a rhythmic, hopeful pulse against the vast wilderness. The dogs, however, behaved strangely. They followed a scent trail from the campsite for about 50 yards to the edge of a nearby creek, and then they lost it completely. They cast about in confused circles, sniffing the air, but the trail had simply vanished. It was as if Ethan had walked to the water's edge and then ceased to exist. After 5 days of exhaustive searching that yielded nothing but frustration and a growing sense of dread, the official designation of the operation changed. The mission shifted from search and rescue to search and recovery. It was a subtle but significant change in terminology, a quiet acknowledgement from authorities that they no longer expected to find Ethan Hayes alive. With this shift, the county sheriff's lead detective, a seasoned investigator named David Reichert, formally took over the case. Detective Reichert's first order of business was to have the campsite treated as a potential crime scene. A forensic team was brought in to meticulously comb through the area again, this time looking for evidence not of an accident, but of foul play. They photographed every inch of the site, collected soil samples, and carefully bagged every item from Ethan's tent for further analysis in the lab. Yet, even under the intense scrutiny of forensic experts, the scene offered up no easy answers. There were no foreign fingerprints in the tent, no unidentified DNA, and no fibers that did not belong to Ethan or his equipment. The ground around the camp was firm and covered in a layer of pine needles, revealing no clear footprints or signs of a scuffle. The lack of evidence was, in itself, deeply unsettling. It suggested a perpetrator who was either incredibly careful or incredibly lucky. With the physical search of the park yielding no further leads, Detective Reichert turned his attention to Ethan's life back in the city. He believed that if Ethan had met with foul play, the reason was likely rooted in his personal or professional relationships, not in a random encounter in the woods. The detective and his team began the painstaking process of reconstructing Ethan's life, speaking with anyone and everyone who knew him. The portrait that emerged from these interviews was overwhelmingly positive and consistent. Friends described Ethan as generous and loyal. Colleagues at his software firm spoke of his sharp intellect, his strong work ethic, and his willingness to mentor junior engineers. No one could think of a single person who would have wished him harm. There were no whispers of arguments, no feuds, no dark secrets. It was during an interview with Ethan's sister, Sarah, that investigators learned of his recent breakup. Ethan had been in a serious relationship with a woman named Maya Collins for nearly 2 years. According to Sarah, the relationship had ended about 2 months before Ethan's disappearance. While Sarah characterized the split as mutual, she admitted that it had been emotionally difficult for both of them. This information immediately made Maya Collins a person of interest. In any investigation of this nature, romantic partners, past and present, are among the first to be scrutinized. Detective Reichert knew that passions could run high in the aftermath of a breakup, sometimes leading to tragic consequences. He dispatched 2 detectives to speak with Maya. When the detectives arrived at her apartment, they found Maya visibly distraught. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she told them she had been following the news of Ethan's disappearance with a growing sense of horror. She spoke of Ethan with genuine affection and sadness, telling the detectives that while their romantic relationship had ended, she still cared for him deeply. However, when asked to provide an alibi for the weekend Ethan went missing, Maya's story raised a red flag. She claimed she had been at home alone the entire weekend, feeling unwell and saddened by the finality of the breakup. She had not seen anyone or gone anywhere. An alibi with no corroborating witnesses is one of the weakest an individual can provide, and the detective's professional skepticism sharpened. The investigators asked for permission to search her phone, and Maya consented without hesitation. A preliminary review showed numerous texts between her and her friends in the weeks following the breakup, expressing her sadness and frustration. To the detectives, some of the language seemed to border on anger, though it was couched in terms of heartbreak. This, combined with her weak alibi, was enough to elevate her from a person of interest to a potential suspect. The media, learning that detectives were focusing on an ex-girlfriend, quickly seized upon the narrative. Speculation ran rampant in local news reports and on social media. Maya Collins was painted as a woman scorned, a potentially volatile figure in the unfolding tragedy. Her photograph was published, and she found herself at the center of a storm of public suspicion, a trial by public opinion that was both swift and merciless. Detective Reichert, meanwhile, remained focused on facts and evidence. He obtained a warrant for Maya's detailed cellular records, which would provide a more accurate picture of her movements than her memory alone. He also requested her financial records and began a more thorough background check. The pressure to solve the case was immense, with Ethan's family desperate for answers and the public hungry for a resolution. The results of the cellular data analysis came back a few days later, and they provided a clear and indisputable answer regarding Maya's whereabouts. The records showed that her phone had been pinging off cell towers in the immediate vicinity of her apartment building for the entire weekend in question. The data was precise enough to confirm that she had not traveled more than a few blocks from her home. Further investigation corroborated her story completely. Her credit card records showed a food delivery order to her apartment on that Saturday night. Security camera footage from her apartment building's lobby, which detectives had also subpoenaed, showed her briefly leaving on Friday evening to check her mail and not appearing again until Monday morning when she left for work. Maya Collins had been telling the truth. She had been home, grieving the end of her relationship, while Ethan disappeared miles away. The revelation cleared Maya's name, but it was a significant setback for the investigation. Weeks of valuable time and resources had been spent pursuing a lead that ultimately went nowhere. For Maya, the experience was a harrowing ordeal that compounded her grief with the trauma of being falsely suspected. For Detective Reichert and his team, It meant they were back at square one, with no suspects and no clear motive. With the personal relationship angle exhausted, investigators delved deeper into Ethan's digital and financial life. They executed warrants to access his bank accounts, credit card statements, emails, and social media profiles. They were searching for anything out of the ordinary: a large, unexplained withdrawal of cash, a secret correspondence, a hidden online life. What they found was a life of remarkable normalcy and transparency. Ethan's finances were in perfect order. He was a diligent saver, and his accounts showed a steady accumulation of wealth with no suspicious transactions. His credit card history consisted of everyday purchases: groceries, gas, outdoor gear from a well-known retailer, and the occasional dinner out with friends. His computer and email accounts told a similar story. There were work-related files, emails with his family, and a browsing history filled with searches for hiking trails, new camping equipment, and articles about software development. Most poignantly, they found he had recently been researching a guided trek in Patagonia, a dream trip he had been planning for the following year. It was the digital footprint of a man with a future, not one who was planning to disappear or who was involved in anything illicit. The one piece of digital evidence that could have been a key to the puzzle remained missing: Ethan's smartphone. The last known signal from the device was a brief ping off a cell tower near the Arrowhead National Forest trailhead, perfectly matching the time he sent his final text to Sarah. After that, the phone either died, was destroyed, or was manually powered off. Without it, investigators were deprived of a crucial source of potential data, including GPS locations, photos, and recent calls. As autumn faded into winter, the case grew colder in every sense of the word. The snows came, blanketing the national forest and making any further large-scale search impossible until the spring. The media attention waned, moving on to newer, more immediate stories. For the investigators, the flow of new leads dwindled to a trickle and then stopped altogether. The case file, thick with reports and interviews that led nowhere, was officially moved to the cold case unit. For Ethan's family, the lack of answers was a unique and relentless form of torture. They existed in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn properly without knowing what had happened to their son and brother. They held a public vigil where hundreds of people gathered with candles to share memories of Ethan, his warm smile and his quiet strength. But the vigil brought no closure, only a more profound sense of his absence. Sarah, in particular, struggled with the void Ethan left behind. She found herself rereading his last text message over and over, dissecting the simple words for any hidden meaning she might have missed. She tormented herself with what-ifs, wondering if she should have pressed him for more details about his trip or insisted he take a satellite phone. The guilt, though irrational, was a heavy burden to bear. Detective Reichert kept the case file on the corner of his desk, a constant, silent reminder of an unsolved puzzle. He periodically reread the reports, hoping a fresh perspective might reveal a missed connection or a detail that was overlooked. But the facts remained the same. A good man had gone camping and had simply vanished, leaving behind a perfectly preserved campsite and a wake of heartbroken loved ones. The forest had swallowed him whole, and the silence that followed was deafening. A year passed, the seasons cycled through, and the snows in Arrowhead National Forest melted. But the thaw brought no new discoveries. The case of Ethan Hayes remained frozen in time, a source of quiet frustration for law enforcement and a persistent ache for his family. It seemed destined to become one of those tragic mysteries that linger forever. A cautionary tale whispered among hikers and campers. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, nearly 13 months after Ethan's disappearance, The phone rang in the sheriff's department's cold case unit. The call was routed to a detective who had inherited the Hayes file from Reichert, who had since been promoted. The caller was a woman, and her voice was trembling, barely above a whisper. She refused to give her name, but she said she had information about what had happened to Ethan Hayes. The detective listened patiently as the anonymous woman spoke in clipped, fearful sentences. She said that Ethan had not been the victim of a random act or a hiking accident. She claimed he had been murdered by someone he knew, a man named Julian Croft. She provided no further details, only the name, before abruptly ending the call. The line went dead, leaving the detective with a single tantalizing clue in a case that had been dormant for a year. The name Julian Croft was not one that had appeared anywhere in the original investigation file. The detective immediately ran the name through law enforcement databases. The search revealed a 30-year-old man with a clean record, save for a couple of minor traffic violations. He had no history of violence, no criminal associations, and nothing that would immediately mark him as a murder suspect. Digging deeper, the investigators discovered a connection, albeit a somewhat tenuous one. Julian Croft had been a colleague of Ethan's at a previous software company they had both worked at several years prior. Interviews with former co-workers from that time indicated that Ethan and Julian had been friendly, but not part of the same social circle. They were work acquaintances who had occasionally shared a lunch or a conversation by the coffee machine. Julian had left the company about a year before Ethan's disappearance, and by all accounts, they had not kept in close contact. The anonymous tip was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The first challenge was to identify and locate the caller. Using the call data, they were able to trace the number to a prepaid burner phone, a dead end. However, the call had pinged a cell tower in a specific residential neighborhood in a city 2 states away. Detectives knew that convincing a fearful witness to cooperate required building trust, and they could not do that if they could not find her. Instead of a direct approach, the lead detective on the cold case, Detective Miller, decided on a more subtle strategy. He released a carefully worded statement to the media, announcing that the department had received a credible new tip in the Ethan Hayes case and was actively pursuing a promising line of inquiry. He made a direct appeal to the person who had called, assuring them they could come forward in complete confidence and that the department's primary goal was to find justice for Ethan. It was a gamble, but it paid off. 2 days later, the woman called again. This time, she identified herself as Anna. She was still terrified, but the detective's public appeal had convinced her that the police were taking her information seriously. Over the course of a long and difficult conversation, Detective Miller gently coaxed the full story from her, and the missing pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with horrifying clarity. Anna had been Julian Croft's girlfriend at the time of Ethan's disappearance. She described Julian as a man who was charming and ambitious on the surface, but who possessed a hidden desperation. For months, he had been consumed by a high-risk cryptocurrency investment, convinced it was his ticket to immense wealth. He had poured all of his own savings into it and had tried to persuade his friends and family to invest as well. The connection to Ethan, she explained, was money. Julian, having exhausted his own funds, had approached Ethan, his former, more successful colleague. He had pitched the investment as a sure thing, promising astronomical returns. Ethan, ever the kind and trusting friend, had agreed to lend Julian $50,000. It was a significant sum, but Ethan had been doing well financially, and he believed he was helping a friend get on his feet. He had Julian sign a simple loan agreement, a formality that Ethan felt was just good practice. The investment, predictably, had been a bust. The volatile cryptocurrency market had crashed, and Julian's can't-miss opportunity had evaporated into thin air, taking Ethan's $50,000 with it. According to Anna, the loss sent Julian into a spiral of panic and denial. He began avoiding Ethan's calls and texts, hoping the problem would simply go away. But Ethan, while patient, was not a pushover. He had lent Julian the money in good faith and had his own financial goals. He was saving for a down payment on a small house and had been counting on the loan being repaid as promised. He began to press Julian, not aggressively, but with a polite firmness that underscored the seriousness of the debt. He wanted to establish a repayment plan. This pressure, Anna said, was more than Julian could handle. His pride was wounded, and he was terrified of the consequences of his failure. He had no way to repay the money. He saw Ethan's reasonable requests not as a lifeline, but as a threat that would expose him as a fraud and a failure. In Julian's warped perspective, Ethan became the source of his problems. Anna told the detectives that Julian had learned about Ethan's planned solo camping trip during one of their last civil phone conversations, weeks before the debt became a major issue. Ethan had mentioned it casually, excited about the prospect of a weekend in the woods. Julian had filed that piece of information away, not with any malicious intent at the time, but it had stayed with him. As Ethan's calls for repayment became more frequent, a desperate and monstrous plan began to form in Julian's mind. He called Ethan and told him he had managed to pull together some of the money. He suggested they meet to discuss the repayment plan in person, proposing that he drive out to Ethan's campsite on Saturday evening. He framed it as a way to talk privately, away from distractions, and to give Ethan the first installment in cash. Ethan, wanting to believe the best in people, agreed. He saw it as a positive step, a sign that Julian was finally taking responsibility. He had no reason to suspect the darkness that was motivating his former colleague. The offer to meet at his remote campsite seemed unusual, but Ethan likely chalked it up to Julian's embarrassment about the situation. Anna then recounted the most chilling part of her story. On the Sunday night that Ethan was due to return from his trip, Julian had come back to their apartment in a state of extreme agitation. He was pale, his hands were trembling, and there was a dark smudge of dirt on his jacket. When she asked what was wrong, he had broken down completely. In a torrent of panicked confessions, Julian told Anna everything. He had driven to the campsite as planned. He had given Ethan a small amount of cash, a token gesture. But when Ethan had insisted on signing a formal document outlining a schedule for the remaining payments, Julian had snapped. The reality of his financial ruin and the humiliation of the moment had overwhelmed him. He had not gone there with a clear plan to kill, but his desperation had created a powder keg. The argument escalated, and in a fit of rage, Julian had attacked Ethan. Ethan, caught completely by surprise, had been unable to defend himself. The struggle was brief and brutal. When it was over, Ethan Hayes was dead. A wave of cold panic had then washed over Julian. He realized what he had done. He had to cover his tracks. He put Ethan's body in the trunk of his car. He then took Ethan's phone, drove a few miles down the road, and smashed it to pieces with a rock, scattering the fragments into the woods. He knew the phone was a tracking device and had to be destroyed. His next move was one of cold, calculated survival. He knew he could not leave the body anywhere near the campsite, as the area would be the focus of any search. He drove for over an hour, deep into a different, more remote section of the National Forest, a place he knew from a previous fishing trip. There, under the cover of darkness, he dug a shallow grave and buried Ethan. He returned to the campsite, made a cursory effort to make it look undisturbed, and then drove home, his mind reeling from the horror of his actions. Anna told the detectives she had been paralyzed by fear. Julian had confessed to her in a moment of weakness, but he had quickly become menacing, threatening her with dire consequences if she ever told anyone. She was his alibi, he had reminded her, and if he went down, he would take her with him. Terrified, Anna had played along, but she broke up with him a few weeks later, citing other reasons, and moved to another state to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man she now knew was a murderer. It had taken her a full year to wrestle with her conscience and overcome her fear. The news reports about Ethan's grieving family had haunted her. Finally, she had decided she could no longer live with the secret. Her anonymous call was a tentative step, and Detective Miller's public plea had given her the final push she needed to come forward and tell the whole truth. Armed with Anna's detailed and horrifying testimony, the investigation into the disappearance of Ethan Hayes was reborn with explosive force. It was no longer a cold case. It was an active homicide investigation with a named suspect and a clear, compelling motive. Detective Miller and his team now had a roadmap, and their destination was Julian Croft. The first step was to corroborate Anna's story. Her testimony, while powerful, was still the word of one person against another. They needed hard, physical evidence to build a case that would stand up in court. The investigators began by quietly re-examining the financial records they had collected a year earlier. This time, they knew what they were looking for. They quickly located the record of a $50,000 wire transfer from Ethan's savings account to an account belonging to Julian Croft. The date of the transfer was approximately 6 months before Ethan's disappearance. They also found the loan agreement that Ethan had scanned and saved to his cloud storage. A simple, one-page document signed by both men. This provided concrete proof of the debt, the central pillar of the motive Anna had described. Next, investigators turned their attention to Julian himself. They placed him under covert surveillance to monitor his movements and activities. He was living a seemingly normal life, working at a new tech firm, and was in a new relationship. He appeared to have successfully moved on, leaving his dark secret buried in the past. To the outside world, he was a successful young professional, not a killer. The detectives then sought to verify the more specific details of Anna's account. She had mentioned that Julian drove a dark blue sedan at the time. Motor vehicle records confirmed that Julian Croft had owned a 2015 blue Honda Accord, but he had sold it about 6 months after Ethan's disappearance. The timing of the sale was immediately suspicious. It suggested a man trying to get rid of a piece of evidence. Tracking down the car was a top priority. Detectives located the current owner, a college student who had bought it from a used car dealership. The police approached the student, explained the gravity of the situation, and impounded the vehicle as evidence. The car was transported to the state crime lab, where it was subjected to a forensic examination of unprecedented intensity. Forensic technicians took the car apart piece by piece, searching for any trace evidence that might have survived the passage of time and the change of ownership. While the lab worked on the car, other investigators focused on Julian's alibi for the weekend of the murder. At the time, he had not been questioned, so he had never had to provide one to police. But Anna had told them that his story to her was that he had been home sick. To challenge this, they subpoenaed his phone records for that specific weekend. The records came back and delivered another critical blow to Julian's story. Just as Anna had said, his phone showed a period of inactivity that was highly unusual. It was powered off for an 8-hour window on the Saturday night Ethan was killed. The phone was turned off shortly before he would have arrived at the campsite and was not turned back on until the early hours of Sunday morning. A time frame that perfectly matched the narrative of the murder and the subsequent disposal of the body. Meanwhile, the crime lab called with a major breakthrough. In the trunk of the Honda Accord, buried deep within the fibers of the trunk liner beneath the spare tire, they had found it, a few microscopic particles of soil. It was a minuscule amount, easily missed, but the lab's powerful equipment had isolated it. They also found a single, tiny chip of rock, no bigger than a grain of sand. Detective Miller knew this could be the linchpin of the entire case. He sent the soil and rock samples to a forensic geologist at the state university. The request was specific. Could the geologist determine if this soil was consistent with the area of Ethan's campsite? And more importantly, could they identify the origin of the unique rock chip? The geologist's report was a masterpiece of scientific deduction. The soil itself was a common type found throughout the region, including around the campsite. However, the rock chip was a different story. It was a fragment of a specific type of metamorphic rock, a green schist, which contained a rare combination of minerals. This particular type of rock was not found anywhere near Ethan's campsite. Using geological survey maps of the entire national forest, the geologist was able to pinpoint a very limited number of areas where this specific green schist was present as surface outcroppings. One of those areas was a remote, rugged canyon, about a 40-mile drive from where Ethan's tent had been found. It was a place rarely visited by hikers, known primarily to a few local fishermen. It matched the description of the secondary location that Anna had provided. The pieces were all in place. They had the motive, the witness, the corroboration of the debt, the suspicious sale of the car, the gap in the phone records, and now, the physical evidence linking Julian's vehicle to a plausible burial site far from the original search area. Detective Miller now had more than enough to secure an arrest warrant. The arrest was executed quietly and efficiently. 2 unmarked cars pulled Julian over as he was driving home from work. As detectives approached his window, his confident demeanor visibly crumbled. The mask of normalcy he had worn for over a year was gone, replaced by the stark, undisguised face of fear. He was placed under arrest for the murder of Ethan Hayes. In the interrogation room, Julian initially projected an air of arrogant disbelief. He demanded a lawyer and insisted there had been a terrible mistake. He denied knowing anything about Ethan's disappearance, claiming they had lost touch years ago. He was a cool and practiced liar, but his composure began to fray as Detective Miller and Detective Reichert, who had requested to be present, began to lay out the evidence against him. They started with the $50,000 loan. Julian paled slightly, but dismissed it as an old business dealing that had been resolved. Then they brought up Anna, his ex-girlfriend. They told him they had her detailed statement. Julian's facade cracked further. He called her a liar, a bitter ex trying to ruin his life. Then Miller laid a photograph on the table. It was a magnified image of the green schist rock chip found in the trunk of his old car. He followed it with a geological map, a red circle drawn around the remote canyon. "This rock was found in your trunk, Julian," Miller said, his voice level. "It only comes from one place, a place you went to that night, a place you went after you left Ethan's campsite. The final piece was the phone records." Miller slid the report across the table, showing the 8-hour gap. "Your phone was off, Julian, for 8 hours. You weren't homesick. You were in the woods, covering your tracks." At the sight of the irrefutable scientific evidence, Julian Croft finally broke. The fight went out of him, and he slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. He did not confess, but his silence was an admission of guilt. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the prospect of a trial that could lead to the death penalty, Julian's lawyer advised him to seek a plea agreement. The prosecution offered a deal. In exchange for a plea of guilty to second-degree murder and his full cooperation in locating Ethan's remains, they would take the death penalty off the table. After consulting with his lawyer, Julian accepted. A few days later, a somber convoy of law enforcement vehicles drove into the Arrowhead National Forest. Julian Croft, shackled and wearing a prison jumpsuit, sat in the back of one of the cars. He directed the investigators off the main park road and onto a series of little-used logging trails, leading them deep into the remote canyon identified by the geologist. He finally pointed to a small, unremarkable clearing beneath a cluster of tall pines. "There," he said, his voice hollow. "He's there." A team of forensic anthropologists had been brought in for the recovery. They carefully excavated the area Julian had indicated. After about an hour of digging, they found what they were looking for. The remains of Ethan Hayes were finally recovered, more than a year after he had been stolen from the world. The discovery, while devastating, brought a small measure of agonizing closure to Ethan's family. The terrible uncertainty was over. They could finally bring their son home and lay him to rest. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death was blunt force trauma, consistent with the story Julian had confessed to Anna. At his sentencing hearing, Julian Croft, dressed in a suit, stood before the court and offered a brief, mumbled apology to the Hayes family. It was an empty gesture, devoid of any genuine remorse. He seemed more concerned with his own fate than with the life he had so callously extinguished. The most powerful moment of the hearing came when Sarah Hayes stood to give her victim impact statement. Her voice, though trembling with grief, was strong and clear as she spoke directly to Julian. She did not speak of hatred or revenge. Instead, she spoke about her brother. She described his laughter, his kindness, his love for the mountains, and the profound goodness he had brought into the world. "You didn't just take a life," she said, her gaze locked on Julian. "You took a source of light from all of us. You took him because of money and pride, and none of it will ever fill the empty space you've created. My brother tried to help you. He trusted you, and you repaid his kindness with the ultimate betrayal." The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of quiet weeping. Julian Croft was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 25 years. As he was led from the courtroom, he did not look at the Hayes family. He stared straight ahead, a man who had chosen to solve his problems with violence, only to create an inescapable prison for himself. The case of Ethan Hayes serves as a tragic reminder of how quickly a life can be undone by greed and desperation. Ethan was a man who embodied the best of human qualities. He was responsible, caring, and willing to extend a hand to someone he believed was a friend in need. His love for the outdoors was a search for peace and solitude, a stark contrast to the violent and chaotic end he met in the very wilderness he so admired. His legacy is not defined by his death, but by the life he lived. It is carried on by his family and friends, who remember him not as a victim, but as a bright, adventurous soul who believed in the good of people. The forest where he died has reclaimed its secrets, but the memory of Ethan Hayes and the senselessness of his loss endures as a testament to a life of promise that was cut tragically and unforgivably short. If you found this case compelling, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth, true crime investigations. Activating notifications will ensure you never miss a new story. We appreciate your support as we continue to explore these complex and important cases. The details of this story highlight the tireless work of investigators and the profound courage of witnesses who choose to speak truth in the face of fear. It is a somber reflection on the dark capabilities of human nature, but also on the enduring strength of those who seek justice. Until next time, stay aware, stay compassionate, and look out for one another.